At 06:18 p.m. on August 12, 1943, over the skies of southern Italy, a U.S. Army Air Force's B-17 Flying Fortress limped westward toward the Mediterranean with more than half of its control surfaces damaged or destroyed. The aircraft was still airborne. That fact alone defied expectation. The bomber had been hit repeatedly by German flak during a raid on oil facilities near Ploiești's southern support network. One engine was out. Another was running intermittently. The vertical stabilizer was partially shredded. Control cables for the rudder and elevators had been severed in multiple places. Hydraulic pressure was gone. Several crewmen were wounded. According to flight manuals and combat experience at the time, a B-17 in that condition was not expected to remain controllable. Loss of primary control surfaces at altitude usually resulted in uncontrolled descent or structural failure. Crews were trained to bail out once stability could not be maintained. Yet this aircraft did neither. Instead, it maintained altitude, gradually descended under partial control, and crossed hundreds of miles of enemy-controlled territory before reaching friendly airspace. Hours later, it touched down on a North African airfield with most of its crew still aboard. In post-mission reports, the aircraft's return was noted as unusual but unexplained. Damage was listed. Casualties were recorded. There was no detailed account of how the bomber remained flyable once its primary systems failed. From the ground, the aircraft's survival appears miraculous. From inside the fuselage, it was the result of a narrow sequence of adjustments made after the airplane ceased behaving as it was designed to. This is not a story about luck or daring in the abstract. It is a story about how a machine remained in the air after its assumptions collapsed, and how survival became a matter of understanding limits rather than exceeding them. The raid that day was part of a broader Allied effort to disrupt Axis fuel production in southern Europe. Bombers flew long distances over hostile territory with limited fighter escort, relying on altitude, formation, and defensive fire for protection. Southern Italy presented a layered air defense environment. Heavy flak batteries protected industrial targets and transport hubs. Lighter guns covered approach corridors. German fighters operated from nearby fields, ready to engage damaged or isolated bombers during withdrawal. Weather conditions were marginal but acceptable for high-altitude bombing. Visibility was good above cloud cover, but turbulence increased during descent. Winds varied sharply with altitude, complicating formation, flying, and recovery of damaged aircraft. The B-17 operated within a tight formation during the bombing run. That formation provided overlapping defensive fire, but also limited maneuverability. Bombers could not take evasive action without risking collision. When flak bursts struck the aircraft, they did so at close range. Shrapnel penetrated control surfaces, severed cables, and damaged internal systems almost simultaneously. The aircraft did not suffer a single catastrophic failure. It suffered many partial ones at once. Once the formation turned for home, the damaged bomber fell behind almost immediately. Reduced power and impaired control made it impossible to maintain position. That isolation increased vulnerability to fighters and forced the crew to descend gradually, trading altitude for stability. The environment offered no margin. Higher altitude meant thinner air and reduced control authority. Lower altitude meant increased exposure to enemy fire and structural stress on a compromised airframe. Every adjustment altered multiple risks at once. The aircraft's survival depended not on evasion or defense, but on whether it could be kept within a narrow envelope where lift, thrust, and control still overlapped. The aircraft commander was Captain Robert L. Anders, age 29, a pilot with a background in civilian aviation before the war. He had flown cargo aircraft and mail routes in marginal weather, where maintaining control mattered more than speed or precision. He was not known as aggressive. His evaluations described him as cautious, methodical, and deeply familiar with aircraft behavior under stress. He trusted instruments, but relied heavily on physical feedback, control pressure, vibration, and sound to assess what an airplane could still do. The co-pilot, First Lieutenant Harold Pierce, had trained as an engineer before flight school. He understood the aircraft's systems intimately and tracked failures not as emergencies, but as constraints that had to be managed. Below them, the flight engineer monitored engine performance manually, adjusting mixture and power without reliable gauges. Gunners tended to wounded crewmen while remaining at their stations, prepared for attacks that never came but could not be ruled out. None of the crew had trained for sustained flight without functional control surfaces. Emergency procedures assumed either partial control or abandonment. What they faced fell between those categories. An aircraft that responded inconsistently, but not unpredictably. When the first control failure occurred, there was no panic. There was assessment. Anders did not attempt to force the aircraft to behave normally. He reduced demands on it, trimming power, adjusting pitch gradually, and avoiding abrupt inputs. The crew adapted instinctively. Tasks were simplified. Communication became concise and functional. Every action was evaluated by a single criterion. Did it make the aircraft easier to keep in the air? Those habits, formed long before combat, would determine whether the bomber descended under control or became another wreck scattered across enemy territory. The B-17 was designed around redundancy and predictability. 4 engines, multiple control cables, hydraulic backups, and clearly defined emergency procedures all existed to ensure that damage could be absorbed without immediate loss of the aircraft. Doctrine assumed that failures would occur in isolation, one system compromised, another taking over. Crew training reflected that assumption. Pilots were taught to diagnose problems quickly, apply checklist solutions, and decide whether continued flight was possible. If primary flight controls were lost or the aircraft became unstable, bailout procedures were clear and unambiguous. Survival of the crew, not recovery of the aircraft, was the priority. What the system did not fully account for was cumulative failure. On Anders's aircraft, damage did not disable one system at a time. It degraded many simultaneously. Rudder authority was partially lost. Elevator response was delayed and uneven. Hydraulic systems failed, forcing reliance on manual control where possible. Engine output varied unpredictably due to shrapnel damage and fuel line disruption. The aircraft was not uncontrollable, but it was no longer operating within known parameters. Formation doctrine assumed that damaged aircraft would either recover with the group or peel off cleanly. Falling out of formation without fighter escort dramatically increased risk. Yet remaining in formation required control precision the aircraft no longer had. Communication doctrine assumed reliable intercom and radio function. Damage reduced both to intermittent operation. Crew coordination depended on shouted reports and visual signals inside a vibrating, partially depressurized fuselage. The system had not failed catastrophically. It had become incomplete. Procedures still existed, but none matched the aircraft's actual condition. Checklists described problems that were cleaner than reality. At that point, the aircraft was no longer being flown according to doctrine. It was being managed. The decisive moment came as the bomber dropped out of formation and enemy territory still stretched far ahead. Captain Anders faced 2 options. The first was to order bailout. Altitude was sufficient. The aircraft was damaged, but still stable enough for crew escape. Doctrine supported that decision. Capture was likely, but survival odds were acceptable. Continuing flight carried unknown risk. The second option was to remain airborne and attempt recovery. Doing so meant flying an aircraft that responded slowly, sometimes incorrectly, and offered no margin for sudden correction. A single additional failure could make bailout impossible. Anders chose to continue flying. The decision was not framed as confidence or defiance. It was framed as assessment. The aircraft was still generating lift. Control inputs still produced response, however delayed. Structural integrity appeared intact enough to tolerate reduced airspeed and gradual descent. Critically, bailout itself carried risk. The bomber was already descending. Some crewmen were wounded. Coordinating a safe exit in damaged conditions could easily turn lethal. Once the decision was made, it narrowed options immediately. Power was reduced to ease stress on the airframe. Airspeed was lowered to improve control authority. Altitude was traded deliberately for stability. The aircraft would not be forced to perform. It would be allowed to do only what it could still do. Survival depended on redefining what controlled flight meant. Anders avoided direct use of damaged control surfaces. Instead, he relied on asymmetric engine power to assist with directional control. Throttle adjustments replaced rudder input where possible. Small changes were made slowly to avoid overcorrection. Pitch control was managed through power and trim rather than elevator movement. Descents were shallow and continuous. Climb was abandoned entirely. The goal was not to maintain altitude, but to maintain predictability. The flight engineer became central to survival. Engine temperatures, vibrations, and fuel flow were monitored manually. Engines showing unstable behavior were throttled back even if it meant further loss of speed. Symmetry mattered more than power. Inside the aircraft, weight distribution was adjusted. Unnecessary equipment was jettisoned to reduce load. Crew movement was restricted to prevent sudden shifts in balance. Even wounded men were repositioned carefully. Navigation was simplified. Rather than precise routing, the crew aimed for general headings that reduced exposure time. Course corrections were minimal. Each turn was planned far in advance. Fatigue accumulated quickly. Constant micro-adjustments required total concentration. There were no periods of relief. Control pressure never stabilized long enough to relax attention. German fighters did not engage the aircraft, likely judging it already doomed. That absence removed one threat but increased another, the temptation to relax discipline. Anders resisted it. The aircraft remained one mistake away from loss. By the time the bomber crossed into friendly airspace, it was no longer flying as designed. It was being kept aloft by balance, restraint, and a shared understanding that survival depended on doing less, not more. The cost of remaining airborne became apparent long before the aircraft reached friendly territory. What had initially been manageable degradation turned into sustained strain on both machine and crew. Physically, the crew operated at the edge of endurance. The constant vibration from damaged control surfaces transmitted through the airframe into hands, arms, and shoulders. Muscles cramped from holding steady pressure on controls that no longer centered naturally. Small corrections required full attention. Lapses of only seconds allowed the aircraft to drift into unstable attitudes. Wounded crewmen deteriorated steadily. Bleeding that had been controlled earlier reopened as altitude and vibration aggravated injuries. Pain management was minimal. The priority remained keeping the aircraft stable, not comfort or recovery. Tasks were reassigned as men became unable to continue, reducing redundancy further. Inside the fuselage, conditions worsened. Smoke from damaged systems lingered in confined spaces. Electrical failures left sections of the aircraft dim or completely dark. The intercom failed intermittently, forcing communication to be shouted over engine noise and wind. Fuel consumption became unpredictable. Engines operating below optimal parameters burned fuel inefficiently. Calculations were revised repeatedly as estimates proved unreliable. The margin for reaching land narrowed hour by hour. Psychologically, the strain was relentless. There was no moment of resolution, no clear transition from danger to safety. Each adjustment that worked briefly reinforced how easily the next one might not. The crew operated in a compressed mental space where the immediate present displaced any thought of outcome. The aircraft remained airborne, but it did so at the cost of exhausting nearly every remaining reserve: mechanical, physical, and mental. The bomber reached North Africa near dusk. The landing was deliberate and cautious, executed at reduced speed and shallow descent to avoid stressing weakened structures. When the wheels finally touched the runway, there was no celebration, only relief that did not fully register until the engines were shut down. Ground crews assessed the aircraft and confirmed what the crew already knew. Control systems were beyond field repair. The bomber would not fly again. Its survival had been temporary, dependent on conditions that could not be reproduced safely. Medical teams treated the wounded. Some crewmen required evacuation for further care. Others returned to duty after recovery, carrying an experience that would not appear in training manuals. In official documentation, the aircraft's return was recorded as exceptional but unexplained. Damage was itemized. Mission results were evaluated separately. The system absorbed the incident without adjustment. Doctrine remained unchanged. The broader air campaign continued. Bombers were lost and replaced. The survival of one damaged aircraft did not alter strategy. It existed as an anomaly, acknowledged but not integrated. Informally, however, crews talked. Pilots discussed the limits of control. Engineers compared notes on asymmetric power and degraded handling. The experience circulated as caution rather than instruction. The system moved forward, having benefited from the outcome without fully accounting for how narrowly it had been achieved. The bomber was eventually stripped for parts and scrapped, its final hours reduced to maintenance logs and brief mission summaries. There is no marker identifying the runway where it landed, no record of how close it came to becoming another wreck across hostile terrain. What remains is the understanding that survival did not come from forcing the aircraft to perform beyond its limits, but from recognizing those limits early and respecting them consistently. The crew did not save the bomber by pushing harder. They saved themselves by asking less of a machine that was already failing. If grounded, carefully researched stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing to the channel to support our team and help ensure these histories continue to be told.